We're continuing on monopoly today, guys, and in the last lecture, we covered just the basics of monopoly. So at this point, I know you understand the assumptions. It's a industry comprised of one firm with no close substitutes and strong or perfect barriers to entry, like patents, licenses, control over resources, and of course, brand name and all those other things would play into it as well. We took a look at the graph for monopoly. And remind me, guys, are we going to have one graph or two graphs when we draw monopoly? Yeah, just one. And in perfect competition, that's different, right? In perfect competition, we have maybe hundreds of firms that take the market price. But here, the firm is the market. So when we draw monopoly, we're going to remember that we only need one graph. And we understand that while perfect competition needs two, that's because there's a whole bunch of different firms in the market. So let's start by taking a look at our monopoly graph. So we had a downward sloping demand curve, and it might be a little bit more inelastic because of lack of substitutes, but we've got a downward sloping demand curve. So remember, guys, downward sloping demand curve means if you want to sell more, what do you have to do to your price? If you want to sell more, what do you have to do to price? Decrease. Yeah, you have to decrease your price, right? You have to decrease your price. And we said that we're going to have a marginal revenue curve that looks like this. Now, make sure you draw it correctly. It's a little bit hard to be perfectly accurate, but it needs to have double the slope, which means it cuts that area from left to right in half. All right? Now, we need to be making a running comparison to perfect competition. So let's do that. Compare to perfect competition. What do we remember about perfect competition? What does the demand curve in perfect competition look like? Yeah, it's going to be, well, we're going to need two graphs, but what does the demand curve look like? Yeah, it's going to be a horizontal demand curve. All right. And where do they get their price from? Right, they take the market price, right? So they're going to adopt the market price. But what about monopoly? Are they a price taker? Are they a price taker? No, the monopolist is a what? Price setter. Good. So we've got price taking behavior for perfect competition, but monopolists are going to be price setters. Good. Now, one thing that we didn't illustrate as clearly, but we're going to do it now, is that we actually have a marginal revenue curve for perfect competition. And that marginal revenue curve is the same as the demand curve. Let's think about why that would be. Let's say that our price is $10. So if our price is $10 and I produce and sell the first unit, what do I get? $10. I produce and sell the second unit, what do I get? $10 more. Does everyone agree? For every unit I sell, I get $10, which means I'm adding to my revenue $10 each time, right? So my marginal revenue would be $10, which is the same as the price. So it's important that we understand that we do have a marginal revenue curve here. It's just the same as the demand curve. But do we see here for monopolists, we've already said that they're going to be a price setter. And we see that the demand curve is not equal to the marginal revenue curve. All right? So we already see some very important distinctions. We've got price taking behavior in perfect competition with our horizontal demand curve, and we see that the demand curve is equal to marginal revenue. All right. So we're going to want to keep some running comparisons. All right. Well, let's focus a little bit more on this idea of marginal revenue. And again, along the way, keep in the margin some notes about perfect competition, because at the end of this, guys, we've got to be able to compare perfect competition and monopoly. You've got to be able to compare and contrast. That's going to be an important thing that you're going to need to be able to reflect on the final exam. All right, so let's continue here and look a little bit more at marginal revenue. So back to our monopolist. Let's draw our downward sloping demand curve and our marginal revenue curve. My marginal revenues are maybe a little bit off. It's a little bit hard to get it exact. But what I want to focus on is, let's draw a little dotted line here. If we're on this side of the graph, if we're on that side of the graph, so here's our marginal revenue. What do I see is true about marginal revenue on the left side of the graph? Is it positive or is it negative? Positive or negative on the left side of the graph? Yeah, everyone agree that marginal revenue is greater than 0 when we're on the left side of the graph. So let's think about what that tells us. If marginal revenue is greater than 0, when we increase our output, so I increase my output and I have a positive marginal revenue, then what's happening to total revenue? Is total revenue going up or is it going down? If I produce more and I have positive marginal revenue, does it make my total revenue go up or down, everyone? Yeah, up, right? Does that make sense? So that's a good thing. If I have positive marginal revenue and I produce more, my total revenue is going to go up. But what if instead we're in this region right here? So let's look at this region. What's happening over here in the purple region? What's true about marginal revenue? What's true about marginal revenue there in that purple region, everyone? Yeah, it's negative. Good. So my marginal revenue here is negative. Everyone agree with that? So if my marginal revenue is negative, when we increase our output, so I increase my output, I produce another unit, only to have negative marginal revenue, what does that tell me? My total revenue is going in which direction? So I produce another unit, and it turns out my marginal revenue is negative 10. What does that tell me about my total revenue? Has it gone up or has it gone down? Yeah, it's gone down, right? So we want to make sure we understand that if we're a monopolist, where do we want to be on this graph? Do we want to be on the left or on the right? Yeah, we want to operate on the left. That makes total sense. We want to operate on the left. So now let's graph total revenue, because now we can figure out total revenue. So that's marginal revenue above. Let's look at total revenue. If we're in the red region, of our graph, what's happening to total revenue? It's going what? Up, right? But if we're in the purple region, total revenue is going which way? Down. So where is my total revenue curve maximized? Where does total revenue hit its highest point? Right? I know it's going up on this side, and I know it's going down on this side. So where do we see the peak? The peak has to be right here. Everyone agree? This dividing point is going to be where total revenue goes from maximum and then starts falling. Everyone agree with that? So you got to draw it correctly. So it's clear here, guys, that the monopolist obviously wants to operate on the left side of the graph, right? It wants to operate on the left side of the graph where marginal revenue is positive. And if they don't, otherwise, total revenue is falling. And that makes no sense. Why should I produce and sell a unit and make my own total revenue fall? That doesn't make any sense. That's not rational. So we know we're going to be operating on the left of this graph. Everybody with me? That makes sense? All right. And so we're going to see that as we draw more graphs. So let's move on then to talk about how a firm sets its output and price. All right. So how does a firm set output and price? Okay. So how does the firm set output? How does it set price? Now, guys, I want to convince you that you already know this. It's exactly like the rule for setting Q star, right, in perfect competition. I'm not teaching you anything new, all right? And I'm going to convince you of that I'm not teaching you anything new here. You already know this. So let's not get ourselves confused. Let's just remember that we've already mastered this, okay? So let's go back to the rule of optimization. And do you guys remember that rule of optimization from the very beginning of the semester, right? Marginal benefit, marginal cost. Remember that rule said if marginal benefit is greater or equal to marginal cost, then it's rational to undertake an activity. So as long as marginal benefit is greater or equal to marginal cost, it's rational to undertake an activity. The only thing that we're doing different here, guys, the only thing that's different is that we have a new word for marginal benefit. In a production setting, when we think about production, so when we think about production, we don't call it marginal benefit. In a production setting, we're thinking about the additional money that we make, when we produce and sell another unit. So in a production setting, marginal benefit of production is going to be the extra money that I make when I produce and sell another unit, right? Right? I'm going to think about producing another unit. What's in it for me? I'm going to be able to sell it, and I'm going to make money when I sell it. What is the term for that, guys? What is it? Marginal revenue. Exactly. We called it marginal revenue. And we calculated it last class period. So we call this marginal revenue. The marginal benefit is the marginal revenue that I'm going to get. So remember how to calculate marginal revenue. Marginal revenue is simply the change in total cost given a change in Q. So all we're doing is calling marginal benefit something different, and we're using the rule of optimization. So we're basically using the rule with a different label, and it says if marginal revenue is greater than or equal to marginal cost, if marginal revenue is greater than or equal to marginal cost, then it's rational to produce another unit. So let's put a star by that. And we've already covered this. We covered this for perfect competition. All right. Now the last thing before we look at this graphically is I want to remind you is that if you use this rule, so if you behave this way, if this is your behavior, then you're going to be as best off as possible. If you behave in this way, you're going to have your profits maximized. So if you want to maximize your profits, you need to behave this way. Or if you're unfortunately making a loss, what's going to happen to my loss? It's going to be what? The smallest it can be, exactly. Or my losses are going to be minimized. But basically we're saying If firms want to be as best off as possible, then they need to follow this rule of optimization, where the rule of optimization simply has a different label on it. That's all we're doing here. All right, so let's take a look. Let's take a look. So let's have a monopolist. Let's find Q star for a monopolist. Okay, so let's find Q star for a monopolist. Let's find their optimal output level. So we've got to put in our downward sloping demand curve and our, oops, that's horrible. Don't do it like that. And our marginal revenue curve. And now let's put in our marginal cost curve. So we want to find the profit maximizing, loss minimizing output level using the rule of optimization. So do we agree, guys, that as long as marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, right, it makes sense to produce. So we would produce all of those units up to this point right here. Everyone agree with that? So as long as marginal revenue equals marginal cost, as long as marginal revenue is greater than, rather, or equal to marginal cost, it makes sense to produce. But guys, does it make sense to produce over here? What's happening over on this right-hand side? Does everyone agree that we see on this side marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue? Do we want to produce those units where marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue? Do I want to spend $100 to produce something that's going to make me 80 bucks in revenue? No. So this would be irrational on this side in green. All right? So we're using the same rule. I want to produce up to the point where I break even. So let's remind ourselves of the shortcut rule. The shortcut rule here is what? How would I express the shortcut rule on this graph of monopoly? The shortcut rule is find the point where blank equals blank. What's the rule? Find the point where blank equals blank. Marginal cost intersects marginal revenue. Good. So I want to find the point where marginal revenue exactly equals marginal cost. Here's my shortcut rule. Does everyone agree that I have found that point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost? If they're intersecting, they have to be equal, right? They're intersecting, they have to be equal. So my shortcut rule, find the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now, let's compare to perfect competition. All right, let's compare to perfect competition. So let's go back to perfect competition and let's show that we're doing the same exact thing in perfect competition. It's exactly the same thing. All right. So we've got our demand curve, which equals marginal revenue. So remember, we've added this on that now we understand that demand and marginal revenue are the same curves. We're going to add in marginal cost. Can I find the optimal output in perfect competition? Right? It's where the demand curve intersects the marginal cost curve, right? Does everyone agree? But the demand curve is also the marginal revenue curve. Everyone agree? So do you agree that I have found the point where, same shortcut rule, we have found the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So if you produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, this is the best you can possibly be. So guys, take a look here for a second. Does everyone agree we've done the same exact thing in monopoly that we've done in perfect competition? Everyone, have I convinced you of that? There's nothing new here. So keep it simple. Keep it simple. All right? So now we can find the monopolist's output, and we already knew how to find output in perfect competition. So now let's talk about finding the monopolist price. All right? Let's find the monopolist price. So how to find the monopolist's price. How to find the monopolist's price. So again, we're going to draw our monopoly graph with our downward sloping demand curve and our marginal revenue curve. Oops, that's a pretty ugly marginal cost curve. I'm going to clean that up. Let's put in a marginal cost curve. All right. So first thing we have to do is find output. So let's make a note of that. We first must find output. And what's the rule? What's the shortcut rule for finding output, everybody? What's the rule? We just covered it 10 seconds ago. Find the output, good, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Everyone agree that's this point right here? Okay, so we found output. So first I have to find output, and I find that output's going to be Q star. And then to find price, let's think about what we have to do to find price. I have output. Where do I go on a graph if I want to map together P and Q? What on this graph maps together P and Q? What curve maps together P and Q? Everybody, what curve? What curve on a graph have we been studying all semester long that maps together price and quantity? Demand, exactly. I need to look at demand, right? Remember, guys, demand curves map together price and quantity, right? Demand curves map together price and quantity. Remember, when we worked with demand curves in a chart form, maybe I had price of 10 and quantity was 100, but if price goes up to 12, maybe people only buy 80, and if price goes up to 14, maybe quantity falls, right? Law of demand. So then what I have to do here, guys, is I've got my quantity. I need to go up to the demand curve where price and quantity are mapped together, and then over. Everybody with me? Super easy. So I go up to the demand curve. I go up to the demand curve. Now, guys, I need to warn you to be extremely careful. You need to be extremely careful because here's a common error. People go up to this point. You have found, they go, oh, yeah, right here. Here's my marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then they come over here. Is that price? What is that I have found? It's quantity? No. Quantity is on the horizontal axis. So what would I be measuring, guys, at that blue line? What am I measuring? I've gone up to a curve and over. What have I found? What curve did I go up to and over? not profit, because I don't have any costs, right? I only got marginal costs. I need average total cost for profit. You guys are making this too hard. Let's think about this for a second. You guys learn how to do this on test 2. If I gave you average total cost for a second, and I told you output was Q0, and I wanted you to tell me average total cost, how would you find it? You'd go up and over, right? And that would be average total cost. Everyone agree? And if I gave you marginal cost, and I said, hey, output's Q0, how would you find marginal cost? You'd go from Q0 up to the marginal cost curve and over. Everyone agree? We simply read the heights of cost curves, right? So why can't you do it on the graph that I just gave you? We already know how to do this. Am I right? If I convince you, you know how to do this. So let's go back and you tell me, if I go from Q star up to this point and over, what have I just found? I have found what? I found marginal cost. Everyone agree? I went up to the marginal cost and over. What else have I found? Marginal revenue. Right? Because it's a point of intersection. If it's a point of intersection, then marginal cost has to equal marginal revenue. Is that right? So, guys, you're making this too hard. Do you agree? You're like totally stumped. But you know how to do this. So, guys, trust yourself that you have learned stuff and all you're doing is applying it to something that looks just a little bit different. All right. So, everyone understand. Let's regroup. We know how to find output. Yes? Everyone can find output? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Can we find price? How do we find price? We go up to the demand curve and over. And if I wanted to find marginal cost, can I do that? Can we find marginal cost? Yeah. Q star up to the marginal cost curve and over. Can we find marginal revenue? Yeah. Up to the marginal revenue curve and over. See how easy it is? So, 2 conclusions that we need to make here. I'm going to ask you 2 questions based on what we've just learned. So, based on what we've just learned, and you need to be able to find Q and P and marginal cost and marginal revenue. So, based on this, question number 1 is for the monopolist. For the monopolist, how do P and marginal revenue compare? For the monopolist, how do price and marginal revenue compare? What do we see? What do we see here? Are they the same? Is price equal to marginal revenue? Do we agree with Maceo? Do we agree? Price is greater than marginal revenue? So price greater than marginal revenue. Do we agree with that? Well, here's my price. And here's my marginal revenue. Looks like price is greater than marginal revenue to me. So we agree with that statement? Okay. And number 2, my second question for you is, for a monopolist, how do price and marginal cost compare? How do price and marginal cost compare? Somebody else, give me an answer. Desmond, how does price and marginal cost compare here? Yeah, how do they compare? Are you sure? How come? Tell me how I know this. All right, because I need to look at the vertical axis, guys. Keep it simple. Look at the vertical axis. Price is up here, right? Price is right here, and marginal cost is right here. So, I think you got a little help there. That's okay. Price is greater than marginal cost. But you understand, right? Everyone understand this? So, think about what this is telling you about a monopolist, guys. What does it mean when price is greater than the firm's marginal cost? What it means is they are basically marking it up, right? So this is showing us that there is markup. The firm is marking up the price of their product above and beyond their marginal cost. If it takes them $10 to produce this unit, they're not selling it to you at $10. They're selling it to you at 15 or 16 or 18. There's markup. So prices are going to be priced. Things are going to be priced above the firm's marginal cost. Now, that might not seem like a big deal because we're used to thinking about that, right? Probably most of the time we're going into stores and there's probably a lot of markup. But the question I have for you here is this also true for perfect competition? Is this also true for perfect competition? So let's take a look, because remember, we need to keep this running comparison between monopoly and perfect competition. So is this also true for perfect competition? Let's take a look. All right. Take a second and catch up with me. All right. So let's look at perfect competition. Okay. So let's draw a graph of perfect competition so that we can compare. Remind me, what does the demand curve look like for perfect competition? Horizontal. What kind of elasticity is that? Perfectly elastic. Good. All right. So remember, we've added something kind of new. We've added an understanding now that this demand curve equals the marginal revenue curve. So make sure you are labeling that and reminding yourself of that this is something we've added on. And we know this is our price. All right. I'm going to put in a marginal cost curve. So can we find the firm's optimal output level? Everyone remember? How do I find output? What's the shortcut rule? Where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. Good. So here's our output right here. Q star. All right. So I have Q, I have P. Now here's my question. If I want to find marginal cost, where is it? Where is it? Well, remember how to find marginal cost. You come up here and over. Does everyone agree that my marginal cost is where price is? And I also see that all of this is equal to marginal revenue, right? So if you see in perfect competition with this horizontal demand curve, we have price, which is equal to marginal revenue, which is also equal to marginal cost. Do you agree? You agree with that conclusion right there for perfect competition? So the two questions we asked, on the previous slide, right? I asked number one, how does price compare to marginal revenue for a monopolist? So what did we say for a monopolist? For a monopolist, we said price was greater than marginal cost. And then I asked, for a monopolist, how does price compare to marginal cost? And we had price is greater than marginal cost. Are those two things true for perfect competition? No. So we see for perfect competition that price equals marginal revenue. We're going to be using that later. And two, we see for perfect competition that price equals marginal cost. Everybody with me? Price equals marginal cost. So think about what that tells us right here, guys. If you're a firm in perfect competition, how are you pricing your product? You're pricing your product exactly at what? Your marginal cost, right? So you're pricing your product at your marginal cost. So is there markup? Do we have markup like monopoly? No. So there's no markup as within monopoly. All right? We call this, we would say the firm is a marginal cost pricer. The firm is a marginal cost pricer in perfect competition. So that's great, but let's understand what it means for us. So guys, tell me here, based on what we've just learned so far about markup and being a marginal cost pricer, please put your phones away. I've asked very nicely. Which is better for us as consumers? Which is better for us as consumers? Do you want your goods produced by a monopoly, or do you want them produced in a competitive environment? Yeah, do you agree? We want it produced in a competitive environment if we're looking at consumers. Now, if I'm a firm, would I rather be a competitive firm or a monopolist? Yeah, if I'm going to own a company, I want to own a monopoly. But from the perspective of consumers, do we agree? We're probably getting better prices under competition. So let's make a note of that this is better for us as consumers. Right? It's better for us as consumers. So,
Is that why there's a lot of pushback on that?
So that's a good question. So if you didn't hear it, especially for the video recording, somebody asked, is this why there's pushback against monopolies? Well, that's one reason. On Friday, we're going to talk about the case against monopoly, and it's not limited to just their price is higher. It's going to turn out that there's other things that make us not think monopolists are great models. And for those of you that have taken legal environment and business, how many of you have taken legal environment? Or you will take it. Didn't you talk about antitrust laws? Well, that's to limit monopoly power, because generally monopolies are not good for you and me. All right? So we're going to answer that question even more fully on Friday, but that's a good question. All right. So we're starting to understand the case against monopoly. Yeah, monopolies probably are not in our best interest, but we'll talk more about that Friday. All right. So now we need to look at profits. Okay. So let's look at, and again, remember, we're looking at economic profits. Economic profits for the monopolist. So let's very quickly remind ourselves that economic profits start with accounting profits, and we subtract off our opportunity cost. All right, so we want to remember the difference. We're going to be talking about economic profits. Remember, we've made an assumption. We're assuming that our cost curves on our graph reflect opportunity cost. So this is going to be important. We're assuming that the cost curves on our graph reflect opportunity cost, which means they are economic costs. So our graphs are giving us economic costs, which means profits will be economic profits. Okay. And we'll talk about that a little more in just a minute here. But we want to remember the idea of economic profits. Okay. We start with our accounting profits. We subtract off our next best alternative. So you've got to make sure you understand that, okay? So let's look at this graphically. And again, I want to remind you folks, nothing new here. We're doing exactly what we did under perfect competition. So keep it simple. We're not learning any new material here. So let's look graphically. Okay. So let's find economic profits for this monopolist. All right. So we're going to, again, start with our demand curve and our marginal revenue curve. Then I'm going to add in marginal cost. So add in your marginal cost curve. So marginal revenue, now we've got marginal cost. And I'm going to now add in average total cost. So remember, we have to draw average total cost correctly. Remember, average costs are intersected from below by marginal cost. So we need to draw it the right way. So I'm going to draw it like this. All right. So make sure that the minimum is being cut through by the marginal cost curve. So it's going to get a little graphically messy. But other than that, we know how to work with this. So let's talk about what we need to do to find economic profit. All right, let's go through the steps of finding economic profit. Step number one is that we need to find output and price. Have we already learned how to find output and price for a monopolist? Guys, do we know how to do this? Find output? So remind me, how do I find output? What's the shortcut rule for output? Yeah, so remember the shortcut rule. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And how do I find price? How do I find price? Go to the demand curve. Good. So read it off the demand curve. Okay? All right, so everyone quickly find quantity and price. Find quantity, find price. Find quantity, find price. All right, so did everyone go to this shortcut point? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the best I can do. Here's the firm's profit maximizing or loss minimizing quantity. And then we went up to the demand curve and over to get price. All right, everyone agree? Okay, so we have P and Q. Next thing that we need is to find total revenue. We need to find total revenue. What is the equation, guys, for finding total revenue, everyone? We've used this over and over. What's the equation? P times Q. Good. Is this the same as profit? Is it the same as profit? No, so don't be confused. Total revenue is not profit, okay? So I need to find a box, an area on the graph, and that area is going to have a height, or a box is going to have a height of P and a length of Q, right? Everyone agree? So here's my height of P, and here's my length of Q. Okay, so everyone agree? I have found total revenue. Okay, I found total revenue. Next, what do I have to do next, guys? I have revenue, but that's not profit. So what do I have to subtract off? My costs. Good. So I need to find total cost. And remember, we're already assuming that our cost curves reflect opportunity cost. So when I find total cost, do we all agree it's going to be economic cost, right? It's going to be an economic cost. How do I find total cost? Say again? Okay. So I start with average total cost multiplied by output. Good. Everyone remember that equation? So I'm looking for a box which is going to represent total cost, and it's going to have a height of average total cost and a length of Q, right? So remember how to find total cost, average total cost. To find average total cost, remember I start at my output level and I go straight up to the average total cost curve. So guys, look at this for just 1 second. Is that minimum point relevant for me, that minimum of average total cost? Is it even relevant for me? Is it relevant? No. So do not be seduced by that point, okay? Once I find output, I go straight up to the average total cost curve, right? That minimum point is irrelevant to me. I'm just coming straight over like this. All right, so now I have found average total cost. So if I take a height of average total cost and a length of Q, everyone agree that I have found this purple box. So last thing I need to do, step 4, to find economic profits, I take total revenue minus total cost. So can I find that area? Can I find that area that represents our economic profits? Everyone agree? Here's our economic profits. Green area. Okay. So, guys, is this positive or negative? Positive profits or negative profits? Everyone agree. So we see here, economic profits are greater than 0. How can I tell? Everyone agree I can tell because my total revenue is greater than my total cost, right? So could I have a loss if I gave you a different graph? Sure. So we could see an economic profit being less than 0. Do we agree if economic profits are less than 0, we call that a loss? We call that a loss. And that would be because total revenue is less than total cost. So a couple of very quick questions in our last 30 seconds. All right, a couple of very quick questions. So in this graph, we see economic profits greater than 0. Everyone agree with that? And we call that supranormal profits. We call that supranormal profits, right? So here's my question. Are firms going to enter and compete these away? What's the answer? Yes or no? Are firms going to enter and compete these away in the monopoly? Are you sure? What's one of our assumptions? Barriers to entry. So the answer is no, they're not going to be able to enter and compete these away. Why not? Well, because barriers to entry exist. So do we agree that it's going to be different than perfect competition? Everyone agree? It's going to be different than perfect competition. So last question, guys. Can a monopolist make economic profits supernormal profits in the long run? Absolutely. If they're making profits in the short run, they can keep those profits in the long run. So they can keep economic profits greater than zero in the long run. All right, guys, we'll continue this next class period.